Here's something most travel guides won't tell you. For Asian travelers, the experience of visiting certain countries is fundamentally different from what a Western passport holder encounters, not because of visa rules or safety rating, but because of how you're perceived the moment you walk through the door. Staring, slurs, being charged more, being denied entry to venues, being told to go back to where you came from. This video is built on data from the World Values Survey, Human Rights Watch, the University of Leicester's Centre for Hate Studies, Stop AAPI Hate, and peer-reviewed academic research. The goal is simple: give Asian travelers the information they deserve before they book a ticket. A quick note on framing before we begin. Asian covers an enormous range of people: East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, Central Asian. The hostility each group encounters varies by destination, and we'll be specific about that where the data allows. Some countries on this list have a long history of anti-Asian prejudice. Others saw hostility spike sharply during and after the COVID-19 pandemic and have not returned to baseline. In both cases, the data is sourced, named, and traceable. This is an awareness resource, not a reason to stay home, but a reason to travel informed. We start in South America, a country many travelers associate with warmth and openness, but where Human Rights Watch has specifically documented anti-Asian incidents. Brazil has a sizable Japanese-Brazilian community, the largest Japanese diaspora outside Japan, and yet anti-Asian sentiment, particularly targeting those perceived as Chinese, has been documented at the community and media level. The conflation of all East Asian people with China, and by extension with COVID-19, produced a wave of hostility that Human Rights Watch flagged, specifically in its global reporting. Brazil's media amplified anti-Asian narratives during the pandemic period, and community organizations documented harassment that continued well after infection rates dropped. Human Rights Watch, in its 2020 global report on COVID-related racism, specifically named Brazil as a country where media had reported harassment and discrimination against people of Asian descent. This wasn't limited to isolated incidents. It reflected a pattern of scapegoating that community groups in São Paulo's Liberdade district, historically the heart of the Japanese-Brazilian community, documented publicly. The broader World Values Survey data also places Brazil in the lower half of the Racial Tolerance Index for its region. Brazil is a country of deep contradictions. It has one of the world's largest and most established Asian diaspora communities, and in major cities like São Paulo, Asian Brazilians are thoroughly woven into the social fabric. The hostility documented here is more targeted and episodic than systemic, and it is most acute for those perceived as Chinese rather than for all Asian ethnicities equally. Solo travelers of East Asian appearance, particularly in smaller cities or during periods of heightened political tension, face the highest exposure. From South America to Eastern Europe, a country where anti-Asian hostility has been documented at the street level across multiple cities. Russia's history with Asian-looking people, particularly those from Central Asia and China, involves a well-documented strain of ethnic nationalism. The Russian group SOVA, which monitors xenophobia and racism domestically, has consistently reported elevated hostility toward Asian-appearing people. That hostility became measurably worse during COVID-19, when Chinese people and Central Asian migrants were openly blamed in public, on public transport, and across Russian social media for importing the virus. The Russian monitoring group SOVA reported to Human Rights Watch that there had been a marked increase in attacks against Asians during the pandemic period, alongside what it described as a wave of insulting and racist commentary directed at Chinese people and natives of Central Asia on social media. Specific documented incidents included people being verbally assaulted on the Moscow metro and in public spaces in cities including Nizhnevartovsk, Ekaterinburg, Tatarstan, and Makhachkala, a geographic spread that rules out a single regional pattern. Separately, the broader dataset on racial intolerance from the combined Washington Post and Business Tech surveys places Russia in the lower quartile for racial tolerance. Russia's geopolitical situation as of 2025 also introduces separate risks for foreign nationals traveling there. This script is focused on racial hostility specifically, but it's worth noting that those risks exist in parallel. On the question of anti-Asian hostility specifically, the documented incidents skew toward Central Asian migrants and Chinese nationals. Japanese, Korean, and Southeast Asian tourists are less consistently targeted, though the underlying nationalism that drives this hostility does not make clean distinctions. Now into Western Europe, and a country that appears in multiple independent reports specifically for anti-Asian hostility. Italy has one of Europe's largest Chinese communities, concentrated in cities like Prato, Milan, and Rome. And yet it also has one of the more documented records of hostility toward Asian-appearing people. Peer-reviewed academic research published in journals covering European migration has identified Italy as one of the European countries where the association of COVID-19 with Asian bodies translated most directly into verbal harassment, physical assault, and discrimination. This wasn't simply pandemic-era noise. The civil society group Lunaria had been tracking anti-Asian incidents in Italy for years before 2020. The Italian civil society organization Lunaria collected over 50 documented reports of assaults, verbal harassment, bullying, and discrimination against people of Asian descent in the early months of 2020 alone, before most of Europe had even entered lockdown. Human Rights Watch cited Italy specifically in its global report on COVID-related racism and xenophobia. Separately, peer-reviewed research published in academic journals on European racism identified Italy, alongside the UK, the Netherlands, and France, as countries where the association of the virus with Asian communities sparked increasing hostility and racist attacks against people perceived as East Asian or Southeast Asian. Italy is a major tourist destination, and the overwhelming majority of Asian visitors travel without incident. The documented hostility here is more acute for residents and long-term community members than for short-term tourists. That said, solo travelers of East Asian appearance in areas with limited tourist infrastructure, smaller towns, rural areas, places outside the main tourist corridors, report more friction than those moving through Florence, Rome, or Venice. Awareness, not avoidance, is the appropriate response here. The Netherlands has a strong reputation for tolerance. That reputation deserves scrutiny. Dutch society positions itself as liberal and open, and on many dimensions it is. But the Dutch Asian community has documented a persistent pattern of anti-Asian racism that predates COVID-19 and has only intensified since. The pattern here is distinctive. Dutch society tends to minimize anti-Asian racism as humor or banter, which makes it uniquely difficult for community members to have their experiences validated. Activists describe being gaslit, told that what they experienced was not racism but a misunderstanding. In February 2020, a Dutch radio DJ aired a song that directly blamed those stinky Chinese for COVID-19. A flood of complaints followed, and a police investigation was opened. The courts ultimately ruled it was satirical and did not prosecute. Shortly after the broadcast, a Chinese student was assaulted and rendered unconscious when she asked a group singing the song in her student accommodation to stop. Vice News, reporting on anti-Asian racism across Europe, documented the Netherlands specifically for this combination of institutionalized dismissal and street-level violence. European Agency for Fundamental Rights reporting also identified the Netherlands as a country where hate crime data collection on Asian communities remained inadequate, meaning the documented incidents are likely undercounting the real total. Amsterdam, Utrecht, and Rotterdam are genuinely cosmopolitan cities with large, established Asian communities and real social infrastructure. The issue is more acute outside major urban centres and particularly in contexts, student housing, nightlife, public transport, where social accountability is lower. The Dutch pattern of framing racism as harmless joking is what makes this entry notable. It's not the severity of individual incidents, but the systemic refusal to recognize them as racism that compounds the harm. France is next, and the data here is specific, recent, and has resulted in actual criminal proceedings. France has a significant East and Southeast Asian community, including a large Chinese-French population concentrated in Paris's 13th arrondissement. The country also has a structural data problem. French law, rooted in a post-Wobbetuit commitment to Republican universalism, prohibits the collection of race-based demographic statistics. That means hate crime data disaggregated by Asian ethnicity is limited, and what exists almost certainly undercounts the real picture. What has been documented is pointed. Research from the MigraChiCovid project, a formal academic study of Chinese migrants in France, tracked the subjective experience of racism among people of Chinese origin before and during COVID-19 and found a significant deterioration. 5 young men appeared in a Paris courtroom after their tweets and retweets inciting hate and violence against Asians directly preceded physical assaults on members of the Asian community in the French capital. A spokesperson for the French advocacy group Safety for All described the shift. It was no longer assaults framed around robbery, but what she called gratuitous violence. France also saw racial offences nearly double in 2 years, from 1,636 recorded cases in 2022 to 3,144 in 2024, according to Statista, though these figures cover all racial groups. Peer-reviewed academic research specifically identified France as one of the European countries where the COVID-19 period produced increasing hostility and racist attacks against people perceived as East or Southeast Asian. France's legal framework does pursue racial hate crimes, and the Paris courtroom case demonstrates that accountability mechanisms exist, even if they move slowly. For Asian travelers, Paris's established communities and tourist infrastructure mean that short-term visits are rarely confrontational. But France's specific refusal to collect race-disaggregated data means that neither the French government nor the Asian community can accurately quantify the problem, which is itself a form of institutional indifference. For longer stays, that gap matters. Germany ranks 5th and stands out for the combination of a documented rise in anti-Asian incidents and a political environment where Asian voices have struggled to be heard. Germany has a well-developed anti-racism legal framework and takes hate crimes seriously, but at least in theory. But anti-Asian racism has historically been minimized, with incidents often framed as isolated or as a side effect of COVID rather than a reflection of deeper structural bias. The German city of Dresden declared a Nazi emergency in 2019, reflecting a far-right presence in parts of eastern Germany that Asian travelers, particularly those moving through less visited cities, would be wise to account for. A 2023 EU-focused survey placed Germany among the highest in the EU for reported discrimination and harassment. A 2023 EU survey found that Germany had one of the highest shares of respondents reporting discrimination or harassment at 64%, equal with Austria, and higher than most EU member states. Separately, peer-reviewed research on anti-Asian racism in Germany documented how COVID-era narratives in German media drew directly on historical yellow peril tropes dating to the German colonial period in the late 19th century. South Korean expats living in Berlin described taking self-protective measures, including carrying pepper spray, and actively seeking out community support groups after repeated friction with people who refused to acknowledge anti-Asian racism when directly confronted about it. Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich are genuinely diverse, internationally connected cities where Asian communities are visible and well established. The risk profile is different in Eastern German cities, where far-right political movements have historically had more traction, and the Asian population is smaller. For short-term tourists in major urban centers, Germany presents minimal overt risk. For longer stays or travel through smaller eastern cities, the data warrants more careful attention. The United States is fourth on this list, and it carries by far the most granular, most recent, and most comprehensive data of any country here. Anti-Asian hate in the United States has deep historical roots. From the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II to the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin. What changed in 2020 was the scale and visibility of the problem. The combination of COVID-19 explicitly racialized political language from the White House and the launch of dedicated tracking infrastructure through Stop AAPI Hate produced the most detailed real-time data on anti-Asian hostility ever compiled in any country. A nationally representative survey by Stop AAPI Hate and NORC at the University of Chicago found that over half of all Asian American and Pacific Islander adults, 53%, experienced a hate incident in 2024. Among young adults aged 18 to 29, that figure was 74%. The most common form was verbal harassment at 48%, followed by institutional discrimination at 24%, physical harm at 11%, and property damage at 10%. South Asians were among the most targeted. Between December 2024 and January 2025, they made up 73% of victims of racist slurs and 75% of victims of violent threats. Anti-Asian slurs on social media peaked in January 2025, the highest level since monitoring began in August 2022. Separately, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission documented that Asian hate crimes rose from 89 reported incidents in 2020 to 248 in 2021, a 179% increase. And 83% of AAPI adults expressed concern about the country's racial climate following the 2024 election. The United States is the most popular destination on Earth for many Asian travelers and students, and the experience varies enormously by city, state, and context. San Francisco's Chinatown and New York's Flushing are not the same environment as a rural town with no Asian community. The data reflects national averages. Your risk exposure as a tourist visiting urban centers will be lower than the aggregate figures suggest. But the scale of the documented problem across multiple years and multiple independent data sources makes it impossible to omit the United States from this list. Australia ranks third, a country that markets itself as multicultural, but where documented anti-Asian hostility has been measured, sustained, and only partially addressed. Australia's relationship with its Asian communities is genuinely complex. The country has a large, economically significant Asian Australian population and relies heavily on Asian international students and skilled migrants. And yet anti-Asian racism here has deep roots, stretching back to the White Australia policy that formally governed immigration until 1973, and resurfaces measurably during moments of political tension. The COVID-19 period saw those tensions spike sharply. The Asian-Australian Alliance received more than 500 documented reports of COVID-19-related racism between April and June 2020 alone, with approximately 40% categorized as racist verbal slurs and around 11% involving physical intimidation. 2 women attacked Chinese students in one documented incident, punching and kicking them while yelling, "Go back to China, and you effing immigrants." Australia's former Race Discrimination Commissioner called for a new national anti-racism framework, specifically in response to the scale of anti-Asian incidents. A University of British Columbia study found that young Canadians of Asian descent, a comparable population to Australia's, were the most likely demographic to have experienced and been affected by anti-Asian racism, suggesting the pattern extends across the Anglophone Pacific. Australia does not have a federal anti-discrimination law with teeth that covers all these situations comprehensively, and victim support for Asian communities remains underfunded. Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane have large, thriving, visible Asian communities where the social environment for Asian travellers is generally positive. The documented hostility is more pronounced at the margins, outer suburban areas, university campuses outside of major cities, and online spaces. Tourists visiting for short periods, especially in urban centres, will likely experience very little overt friction. But the gap between Australia's multicultural self-image and its documented record of anti-Asian hostility is larger than most tourism content acknowledges. The United Kingdom ranks second, supported by some of the most specific and recent data on anti-Asian hostility of any country in the world. The UK has a large, long-established South Asian community, primarily Pakistani and Indian, who have faced racism for decades. But the focus of this entry is on East and Southeast Asian communities, a group the UK's data collection systems have historically failed to track properly. The University of Leicester's Centre for Hate Studies, working with the charity protection approaches, produced a landmark 2024 report that changed that picture significantly. The 2024 University of Leicester report found that 45% of East and Southeast Asian people in the UK had experienced a hate crime in the past year alone. That is not a lifetime figure. That is the past 12 months. 99% of those who experienced hate crime reported negative impacts on their well-being. 90% said the experience made them upset. 72% reported anxiety. And critically, only 10% of hate crimes against ESEA people are reported to police. That means the official figures represent approximately 1/10 of the actual problem. The report also found that 53% of perpetrators were under 30, confirming that this is not a generational remnant but a current and active pattern. During COVID-19 specifically, hate crimes against East and Southeast Asians in the UK tripled in the first quarter of 2020 compared to the year prior, and that elevated level has been largely sustained. 1 in 7 people in the UK said at the height of the pandemic that they intentionally avoided people of Chinese origin or appearance. London is one of the most diverse cities on Earth, and its Asian communities, South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, are large, visible, and deeply embedded. The risk profile in central London is meaningfully different from smaller English towns or parts of Scotland, where Asian populations are smaller and less established. The 45% figure comes from a national sample, not just urban centres. For Asian travellers spending time outside major cities, the data is a genuine reason for awareness, not just abstract concern. And at the top of this list, a country that ranks first across multiple independent global datasets on racial intolerance, with specific and documented patterns of hostility toward people of East and Southeast Asian appearance. India's racial intolerance score is the highest recorded across the combined Washington Post and Business Tech surveys, drawn from approximately 85,000 respondents across 61 countries. For Asian travellers specifically, the relevant dynamic is colorism, a deep-rooted preference for lighter skin that shapes social interactions, media representation, and daily treatment of anyone perceived as darker or phenotypically foreign. East and Southeast Asian travellers in India, particularly in areas outside major tourist corridors, consistently report staring, unsolicited photography, mocking gestures, and being asked to to pose for photos without consent.
These are not isolated incidents.
They are documented patterns. Approximately 43.6% of Indian respondents said they would not be comfortable with a neighbor of a different race or ethnicity, the highest proportion of any country in the combined survey data. Chinese social media users have documented and widely shared experiences of anti-Asian discrimination encountered in India. East Asian students studying in Indian cities have reported targeted harassment. The US News Best Countries Racial Equity Ranking places India among the lowest-ranked countries in its 89-country assessment. For context, India has one of the lowest rates of immigration and foreign residents of any large country, meaning that for many people encountered in daily life outside major cities, an East or Southeast Asian traveler represents genuine novelty. That novelty, combined with the documented tolerance levels, produces a specific and consistent type of social friction. India receives millions of tourists annually, and the experience of visiting Rajasthan, Kerala, or Goa as an East Asian traveler is not the same as living in a smaller Indian city for months. Tourist infrastructure in major destinations is well developed, and individual interactions are often warm. The documented racism here operates most acutely through social attitudes: staring, uninvited contact, objectification, rather than through organized hostility or violence. That makes it different in character from some other countries on this list. But across every dataset consulted for this video, India ranks at or near the top for racial intolerance. That is a consistent finding, not an outlier. 10 countries, every one of them supported by named, sourced, traceable data. No country on this list was included based on anecdote or impression. 3 things worth carrying with you. First, the countries that top this list are not all what you'd expect. The United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States all appear here, and all 3 have significant anti-Asian communities actively documenting and fighting back against the hostility they experienced. The existence of that pushback is, in itself, a sign that accountability mechanisms exist, even if they're inadequate. Second, the experience of an East Asian traveler, a South Asian traveler, and a Southeast Asian traveler is not identical in any of these countries. The hostility is often targeted at specific phenotypes, specific nationalities, or specific political associations. The data in this video names those distinctions where the research does. Third, none of this is a reason to stop traveling.
Knowledge is not a cage, it as a tool. Knowing that 45% of East and Southeast Asian people in the UK experienced a hate crime last year doesn't mean you won't have a good time in London.
It means you go with your eyes open, you know which neighborhoods to gravitate toward, and you know that if something happens, you're not imagining it, and you're not alone. The links to every primary source used in this video are in the description. Every figure traces back to a named institution.
Travel smart,